is being described as the worst attack on the Jewish community in the United States' history. Canadians watched with horror the reports of a gunman who killed 11 people and injured 6 at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. It is the latest in a series of horrific attacks in the United States, incidents which are occurring at a time when political and social tensions continue to rise. And it has American politicians taking each other to task about how to deal with the rising crisis. Here in Canada, community leaders, politicians, and ordinary Canadians are all asking the questions like, do we suffer from the same ills here? And if so, what can be done? Joining me now to discuss this is Brian Herman. He is the Director of Government Relations for B'nai B'rith Canada. Mr. Herman, thanks for coming in.
Well, thank you. It's a sad time, but we appreciate your seeking our views on these important issues.
Well, I was going to say, on behalf of all of us, obviously, to the Jewish community in Canada, we extend our condolences and our thoughts, because I know this is something that has rocked the community. I said that we're all wrestling with this question, and that is, here in Canada, as we watch the atrocity that happened in the States, how close are we to experiencing something like this in Canada? I mean, a lot of people are saying, how would you describe the situation in Canada as we watch what happened in the U.S.?
Well, you never know when these incidents are going to occur. The Jewish community in Canada is strong, it's vibrant, it's resilient. We have always been careful because of the concern over anti-Semitism. It's a phenomenon that affects us in Canada, just as it's affecting many countries globally. The sense of anti-Semitism is not as pervasive here in Canada as it is in many other countries. But we must remain vigilant, and we must remain united in confronting it. And we saw last night in Ottawa a very poignant vigil, bringing together many leaders of the Jewish community and many other faith communities, civic and municipal leaders, all united in saying this sort of anti-Semitism will not be tolerated in Canada.
We have Statistics Canada releases, for example. 2 years ago they released, last year they released figures for 2016, and there are statistics on incidents of racism and hate crime. And one of the headlines was that there was an increase in incidents concerning the Muslim community. Another headline was an increase of incidents concerning the Black Canadian community. In terms of the Jewish community, what's the trend?
Well, B'nai B'rith Canada has for many years been publishing an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents in Canada. It's an authoritative analysis respected here in Canada and internationally. And one of the things that we've been very keen to point out is that the Jewish community in Canada remains the most targeted of the religious communities there are. We noticed an uptick last year in anti-Semitic incidents, according to our latest report. The 5-year trend has shown a fairly steady increase in anti-Semitism. In this past year, we've noticed a particular increase in vandalism, which concerns us greatly. So the trends are not good. We are determined to continue our dialogue with all levels of government to address these issues and to look forward to see what can be done to confront the anti-Semitism we see today, to understand it, to educate about it, and also to come up with specific ideas about how to deal with it.
Does anti-Semitism get the attention that, I don't know, maybe more recent upticks in hate incidents are getting? For example, I mentioned, and I'm not playing one off against the other, but I mentioned there was a particular spike of interest and headlines after that horrific incident against the mosque in Quebec City. But does anti-Semitism, I'm saying this because I've heard this from friends in the community, does anti-Semitism get the attention in the media and in population as general?
One of the concerns we have is that Canadians have been exposed to attitudes of anti-Semitism, what some people call soft anti-Semitism, for many, many years. It makes them a little bit more resistant to the message that we must be concerned at all acts of anti-Semitic violence, thought, expression. The point that B'nai B'rith Canada makes in its analysis is that anti-Semitism is often seen as the canary in the coal mine. That is, acts of hatred directed against the Jewish community are illustrative of acts of hatred against many other minority communities. So that's why we say that in combating anti-Semitism, We must work together to combat all forms of racism and xenophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, basically hatred and bigotry that's motivated by any number of reasons.
When we look at the United States, we hear in some quarters they're talking about conspiracies. They're talking about George Soros. They're talking about rich Jewish interests. There's even, the president has talked about Jewish groups helping this convoy coming from Honduras and Central America. So this is sort of infiltrating the speech in some quarters in the United States. Are you concerned that that kind of speech, those kind of theories are trickling up here via social media, via the discourse that's down in the United States?
So those sorts of themes have characterized many societies over many, many years. We're not immune from that. The suggestion that the Jewish people control the banks, or that somehow they're manipulating government, or they're manipulating issues related to immigration and refugees. And we must confront those vigorously, because those are simply not true. It is the case that people see what's happening in other countries. The United States is one example. There are many examples of what's happening in Europe, a rise of xenophobia, of anti-Semitism. And people see this and they're affected by it. So one of the things that we're very keen to do is to do what we can to combat, working with government, with service providers, online hate, online anti-Semitism, deal with it forthrightly and not tolerate it.
How are Canadian politicians doing?
I think Canadian politicians understand the nature of the challenge we face, and they're prepared to confront anti-Semitism as they are prepared to confront other forms of racism, xenophobia, and bigotry. Here, the point we often make is leadership is the key. Our political, our civic leaders at all levels of government must be prepared to speak out forthrightly whenever concerns are brought to their attention.
Do you have are there any worrisome trends you see? I mean, we're being told, for example, that the next election, in terms of political rhetoric, is going to be a nasty one. We've heard talk about extreme multiculturalism in some quarters. Do you have any concerns in Canada?
We're less concerned about the discourse amongst Canada's political leaders. As I said earlier, I think that they all understand the nature of the problem that we face. Anti-Semitism can be corrosive. If you allow it to infect the body politic, it can affect so many others. And in a multicultural country such as ours, that cannot be allowed to happen.
And last question, the internet. What do you do about the internet? When we live in an era where you can turn on the internet and have the most vile things coming through the wires.
Well, the key here is education. So we have a number of proposals working with Canada's federal and provincial leaders to improve the education system in relationship to young people coming to understand what anti-Semitism is, how to confront it, how to spot it when it appears in social media postings, for example, and how to deal with it if there is a real cause for concern.
Okay, Mr. Herman, I want to thank you very much for coming in.
Well, thank you again for seeking our views.